Tuesday, January 17th, 2017, Cappy's Cage, the podcast. Thanks for listening. Today, I want to talk a little bit about what's been on my mind, always usually as it pertains to baseball and how it can be applied to help the individual player development. And what I want to talk about today is confidence versus ego. I know a lot of young ball players, and for that matter, all the way up to the top of the food chain in the major leagues. Everybody's heard the term confidence, and everybody wants to apply that to their game, and it's a very important piece of the puzzle. But what also lingers out there is that ego, and I think a lot of athletes of all ages kind of end up failing to realize what the ego actually is. And certainly I'm not a psychologist or claim to be or anything, but I think I have a really good sense of how some of these philosophies work and cross over into competition sport, introspective, how you view yourself, and then being able to analyze that and then apply it to training and competition and execution and stuff like that. So I think, in my opinion, confidence is being comfortable with yourself and identifying flaws, strengths, and weaknesses, and regardless of the result, being able to continue on the path of successful player development, getting better, self-improvement. But there's that humility involved in someone who's very confident. And I think on the surface, when young players start to learn about confidence and stuff, they just think it's this, walk around with your chin up and think you're better than everybody else and, fool the mind into thinking you can achieve something that you really can't. So that's confidence. And then the other thing I want to talk about is ego. Because lately I've been being exposed to traveling around a little bit, talking to, major leaguers, talking to some people that deal with high-level athletes and, really putting myself out there to absorb and learn and put my own spin on things and take from what I see, how people act, how people train, and then ultimately how people execute and perform. So everything leading up to performance. So ego, I've been thinking to myself a lot that ego can really be the downfall of a lot of players. That when the ego gets in the way, it's a roadblock for development. It's not something that's going to enhance development. This is my belief. So I kind of gave you at least my generic definition of confidence. Now, my generic confidence of ego would be your sense of who you think you are or where you stand in the food chain, how good you think you are. And that's a dangerous thing because do we ever consider that we can be wrong about how good we think we are in relation to, say, your skills on the playing field or your drive, your commitment, your dedication, discipline, all this stuff. So what happens a lot with athletes is that their own sense of where they stand, their strengths and weaknesses, are wrong a lot of times because of outside influence, because of a false sense of achievement, And now in the baseball world, that's at an all-time high. And don't get me wrong, when I talk about this stuff, like I've been through it all as a player, and I'm certainly guilty of thinking along these type of lines. And I've kind of, in reflection, I've looked back at my own career and basically, very disappointed on, my lack of knowledge of stuff like this that I'm talking about now. And that's kind of the whole basis of how I train and teach now is, I always ask myself, well, what happened to your career? What were the roadblocks you ran into? Why aren't you still playing? Why didn't you have, an extended playing career? Right? So I think when people learn from experience and are able to analyze it and then make adjustments to their approach and then apply that, they come out the other end better for it. So I think that's the stage I'm at right now, and I'm just trying to apply that to my teaching, my training, my mentorship. So anyway, back to how I think ego is destroying a lot of baseball players. So I'll give you an example of my own career. Okay, so I'm 18 years old, just turned 18, graduating high school, and then the draft is a week later, and I'm selected in the second round, 57th pick overall. And this is basically after probably being projected to be like a easy first round pick. But I remember, I remember thinking a huge sense of accomplishment, that I achieved something great, I accomplished something, and I almost felt like, wow, everything's paid off, and my commitment, my hard work, and here's the crowning moment. And and I remember kind of breaking down a little bit emotionally, by myself, just thinking like how overwhelming that moment was. Okay, so on the surface, that sounds cute. Yeah, you should appreciate, it is a kind of an achievement. Good job. You graduate high school, you're 18 years old, and you're one of the top amateur talents in the world, and now you're being selected into professional baseball. You're foregoing college, which you had a full ride scholarship to one of the top programs in the country, and then now here you go. And okay, so I had this huge sense of accomplishment that goes into the ego. Okay, but in retrospect, in reflection, I wish I had the outside influence or the mentorship, and I had, starting with my family, I have great people around me. But when you're dealing with this, no one in my family played professional baseball. No one, very few people end up going through this process. So you're not surrounded by a bunch of people that have been through this before. So you really don't know what the angle to take. And again, the foundation of my teaching and training and mentorship is this, so hopefully some people listening to this might go through this one day. So rather than feeling that sense of achievement and accomplishment and letting that go to the ego, I should have had the thoughts of, you're just now getting started on your journey. You haven't really achieved anything yet. You simply, were blessed with some good talent and ability, and you really, as much as you would like to think you know everything about baseball, or you're really good at it. You're really not, and you have a long way to go, and you're just starting this journey. And open yourself up to a lot of the things you can learn and better yourself from. So, stripping the ego down and evaluating where you're at in this certain place and time, and then starting your journey towards never-ending player development. So that should have been more of the thought process along that line. So that's an example of something, in my own career. So now what I see, fast forward literally 20 years, this is 20 years ago, 1997 to now, 2017, and what do we see in the landscape of amateur youth baseball? Is that now everything's accelerated to the point now where these kids are now feeling this sense, the same sense I felt at 18, a sense of achievement and accomplishment, and the ego's being driven, and you have this small sense of celebrity status or whatever. Now these kids are getting that when they're 14, 15, 16 years old. In some cases, 12 and 13. Because our culture now in baseball, amateur sports is driven by this exposure, this mass amount of exposure. And then you piggyback the social media on top of that, and it's exponentially growing. So now, you could have a kid who's 14 years old. He's already got a scholarship, verbal scholarship offer by maybe one of the top programs. And this kid's head spinning like, wow, I must be amazing. I must be great. I must be the greatest thing in baseball right now. And, people are following me on my Instagram and my Facebook and my Twitter and all this, and again, it just is what it is. I'm not saying that that's bad. What I'm saying is that how it's perceived and how it's handled from within, from the individual. Okay, so it's the system is set up like that. So we have to learn and educate ourselves about ourselves, how we tick, surround ourselves with good people that can help us, educate yourself about this process, and come out the other end better. So when that 14 or 15-year-old kid has that ego trip, again, ego being what I'm talking about, a false sense. It's your own personal sense of how good you are, or how you go about your daily life. It's your own personal sense rather than an outside perspective, which is, listen, kid, you've got a long way to go. You haven't really done anything. Keep producing, keep developing, and keep getting better, and start, what I call it with a lot of my players is building your resume. Continue to build your resume. Whether you've done some cool things in some exposure camps or some summer, club ball, or, and then into high school, all that opportunity is opportunity to build your resume. So continue to build your resume. Whereas some kid who might have just got a scholarship, or in my case that I just talked about, being drafted, is this total false sense of achievement, where you stand and how good you are and what direction you're going, and then how that works on your ego, your mind, as opposed to confidence, which is something very different. Confidence is more of that into reflection of yourself, to say, listen, I know I have some serious weaknesses in my game that I need to work on, whether it's physical or mental. And at a younger age, it's usually more physical, and then more experience, higher level stuff is a little more mental. So, being confident with that, like, hey, man, I really struggle at this. And another example for me, too, was I was a switch hitter, natural lefty, but switch hit my whole life from an early age. And I talk to, switch hitters about this a lot, is, the willingness to say, listen, it's inevitable, it's a fact, you're going to be better from one side than the other. Okay, that's a fact. So, hone in and focus on that weak side, that weakness, to make sure because you're always going to have to work twice as hard to get that weakness up to par with what would be considered your strength or your stronger side. So, if your ego takes over and you just buy into, again, another case was someone once compared me to Chipper Jones as a player. And obviously very unfair for an 18, 19-year-old kid, but when you read that, your ego goes, wow, that's cool, I'm that good. Well, the reality of it is you're not that good, and it's an unfair comparison, and it's not going to help you at all. There's nothing in that unfair comparison that will help you in your individual player development. That goes straight to the ego rather than helping out in the confidence category. Okay, so there's a lot of training and teaching and knowledge and information that we can take in as a player on both sides, confidence and ego. And I think it's just important to understand, both sides of the fence and how we can move forward and build on those two aspects without heading down a very destructive path, I think, with ego. And again, people think ego a lot, and they think this very brash, cocky, arrogant, conceited person. That's not necessarily the case at all, because when the wheels are turning in your own mind, and this is kind of more how I was, is I could fool myself into thinking I'm the baddest fucking dude out here on this field. But if that's going straight to your ego and it's not the reality, then you have a problem, because again, your ego's tricking you into thinking something that is factually wrong. And that's a hurdle that a lot of people struggle with, is like there's no there's no reason to fool your mind into thinking you are something that you're not at that present moment, right? And that's what ego can do. It can be very destructive. And then the shame that comes with not performing and letting your own self down because your ego was built the wrong way, under the wrong foundation, under the wrong guidelines, that's a downward spiral. Whereas confidence is comfort with failure, picking yourself up and learning and developing further, asking for help, humility. I'm not that good. Hey, asking for other opinions, experimenting, again, and just to reflect on my own career, I mean, there were times where maybe as a professional you'd struggle and you just think to yourself, well, just go back and do what you did in high school, where you just literally dominated or whatnot. It's not that simple, So if you fool yourself into thinking, well, I can just do that, I can flip that switch, and you waste 3 to 6 months or 3 to 500 at bats on that, you're really wasting your development as a player. Rather than thinking, listen, maybe I wasn't the complete player at 18 or nowadays 13, 14, 15. Maybe I didn't know everything. Maybe I wasn't on this path to guaranteed success. Maybe I wasn't. Maybe that was all just built in my own mind and those close to me based on a false sense of evaluation and productivity and exposure, really. I think that's what it comes down to. So, obviously I'm not a doctor or a psychologist. So like when I'm talking, definitions of confidence and ego, maybe by the book, those aren't the exact definitions. But in my opinion and how I relate it to sport and baseball specific, and such a terribly difficult sport, that's how I see it, is that confidence is something you can be. You train and work. You're in the moment more. You focus more on the process. You take more pride in the process, the training, the learning, and when you commit to that level in amount of training and learning, and applying and experimenting, and then heading into performance and execution, your confidence is high because you've gone through it. And you've been exposed. And again, something I pride myself on. And if you're not training with somebody that's picking you apart, you're not on the right path. And by picking you apart, I mean they're not telling you how great you are. They're exposing your weaknesses. I always try to expose weaknesses early on when I first meet somebody. And it's a delicate situation sometimes when it's a young player, because a lot of times when I've met them for the first time, they think they're awesome. They're the best 10-year-old, 12-year-old, and they have already the seeds are being planted for this ego rather than trusting confidence. And when I've had my most successful experiences training, working with those type of kids, it's when I've literally got them to almost break emotionally, like, wow, buzzsaw, I've never run into anything like this. All anyone's ever told me is how great I am. Everybody fights over me in town to get me on their club baseball team. People are fake and tell my parents things just to appease them, and then you're dealing with this kid. By the time he gets to the important ages of development at the amateur level, which I guess they're all important, but heading more into college or the draft, you have this total false sense of ego, because you've been in this bubble of false sense, really. So get out of that bubble. I don't like when either it's done by parents or organizations, institutions, and again, we've talked in the past about, club ball in high school and all this stuff. And there's an important piece of all that, exposure and camps and all this stuff. But never should you be trapped in a bubble. And people like to do that because it's secure and safe. And no one's going to ruffle feathers. No one's going to tell me what I don't want to hear. And then, therefore, basically you're severely hurting yourself. When I call it the real world, when you go out in the real world and really have to perform, pre-draft or for college recruiters, when they don't take in consideration who your parents are, or they don't take in consideration how many trophies you have in your trophy case, and they don't take in consideration what institution or organization you played with the last 5 or 10 years. They don't take in consideration. What they take in consideration is what they see in front of them at that moment, at that time. And then, then you're fairly evaluated on literally what you are at that moment. So if you haven't backtracked years and years with your training and your understanding and your philosophy and your approaches, if you don't know that leading up to that, you get blindsided. Like the typical kid that gets cut freshman year of high school baseball, but they've had this fabulous club baseball career, and they've never been exposed to reality, and then they get cut, and then their parents complain, and the kid cries, and it's probably the end of their baseball career, because they have this dose of, whoa, what have I been doing the last 3 or 4 years? How have I been fooling myself? And it's a tough thing to do. I've given you examples of my own career. I mean, this is literally, this could apply definitely to me and my beliefs as a young baseball player. How the difference between understanding confidence and ego. So, it's around themselves with those people, and they keep those people close, and it's a constant, practice of evolving as a player, experimenting, and building that confidence, building that confidence. So, that's what I believe the difference between confidence and ego, for whatever it's worth, because I think a lot of times, my experience in the history of dealing with like sports psychologists and stuff, which was just coming into the scene, when I was kind of ending my career, but now it's very, relevant, but my personal experience was always that, the psychologists never played baseball, and, the baseball guys aren't, educated on psychology. So you have this big bridge between this guy who's talking to me about how he's going to help me play baseball, and he's never, played a game of baseball in his life. So that was kind of the baseball player mentality back then. And then, of course, you have the typical athlete jock who just, driving to get themselves by on the physicality of things, and not wanting to give somebody a chance. And then that, that naivete that they know everything about how their mind works, and that's certainly not the case either. So I think as we evolve and stuff in the training and different people, I think I'm just getting to that point now in my professional career, that I think I can bridge the gap a little bit without being a doctor of psychology. But I have friends that I pick their brains a lot, and I've always tried to apply how this can enhance player development of a baseball player. So I think it's important, especially for this young generation now. It's a crazy world we're living in, and kids can get sidetracked really at an early age now. And to reach that potential, I think, is the end goal. How do we reach that potential that is within us? And it's difficult, and no one's got all the right answers. But I think when you can, find time to listen to people that you respect, and take little things that you've learned or heard someone talk about, and you think that might be work for you, experiment with it, and you'll find that it works or it doesn't. If it doesn't, discard it. But it's worth the conversation, or putting yourself out there to educate yourself and experiment with the knowledge. I certainly do that myself. I listen to podcasts all the time, and most of them don't relate to baseball. It's just more of educational experience for myself, and then I kind of take things and try to apply it to my profession. And so there you have it. Any questions or comments, feel free to reach out. Appreciate you listening. This was episode 16, so certainly a lot more to follow. So.